Now that we've looked at the major layers of the skin and, of course, the subcutaneous layer, let's talk briefly about the functions of the skin, and then we'll examine some of those derivatives and structures found within the skin. This image is on page 196 and 197 of your textbook. I know it's a little hard to see these tiny little boxes of text, so I'm going to talk you through it. And of course, you can write notes as much as you want. All right, so let's begin with functions of the skin, which the obvious is protection from the external environment, because the skin is a barrier between inside and outside. So it offers protection against chemicals, toxins, microbes, excessive temperature changes when it's too hot or too cold. As we've talked about with the melanocytes, we've seen that the skin protects us from the solar radiation because those melanocytes become active and produce the increased amount of melanin that gives our skin that tanned look. But even though we get a sunburn or a tan, the deeper tissues, the muscles and internal organs, are protected by the skin. The skin prevents water loss or gain. Now, the epidermis is water resistant, not waterproof, because we always lose some water through our skin. Now, it's obvious we know we lose water when we sweat, but if you put your hand on a cold table, especially something like a marble top table or one of the tables in lab, and lay your hand on it for a minute or so, probably not even that long, a few seconds, and raise your hand up, and you'll see an imprint of your hand if the table is a dark color. That's because you have an action called transpiration, where the water just slowly penetrates through the epidermis and evaporates into the surrounding air. We don't know what's happening, but we can see it when we put our hands on something cold like that. Now, we know the skin is important in preventing water loss, but it's really important when we think about individuals that are suffering from burns, because one of the most severe dangers of burns is dehydration, because without that protective barrier, larger amounts of water can escape from the tissues. Now, we talked about water loss. The skin also helps you to not gain too much water. I mean, think about it. If the skin didn't regulate water going in and out of the body, what would happen when you took a bath, or if you went to the beach and got in the water? You'd swell up like a sponge. So, water resistant, not waterproof. A major function of the skin is to convert a steroid molecule into vitamin D that's later converted to calcitriol. Now, this begins when sunlight strikes the skin. It causes vitamin D to be formed. Now, when it gets converted to calcitriol, that's the active form of vitamin D. Its role is to increase your absorption of calcium from the food products in your small intestine that you've digested. Now, think about that. If we don't get the calcium out, where's it going? To the toilet. If we don't have vitamin D, we can't absorb the calcium, so it stays in the intestine. Have you ever noticed most of the time your milk container will say fortified with vitamin D? Now you know why. But if you just get about 10 to 15 minutes of direct sunlight a day, your body will produce enough vitamin D. The skin is also responsible for secretion. So the skin secretes sweat when it is released from sweat glands, and that acts to release excess heat from the body. We also secrete sebum, which is an oily mixture of lipids secreted by the sebaceous glands. These secretions serve to lubricate the epidermis and the hair and help to make the skin a little more water resistant. Now, the skin is responsible for absorption. Absorption means to take something in. So the skin can absorb certain chemicals and drugs, such as estrogen from a birth control patch or nicotine from a nicotine patch. So we refer to the skin as being selectively permeable because some things can pass through it and others can't. In a process that we call transdermal administration, trans across, dermal, skin. So transdermal administration is when drugs that are either lipid soluble or they're in a lipid carrier can be administered by placing an adhesive patch on the skin. It stays in contact with the skin surface, and the drugs then slowly penetrate the epidermis and get absorbed into the blood vessels that are there ready in the dermis. Should be obvious that the skin helps us to regulate temperature. So because we have those blood vessels in the dermis, dermal blood vessels play an important role in body temperature and blood pressure regulation. Vasoconstriction means blood vessels get smaller. So the diameter of the vessel, the open part, the lumen, gets smaller, so less blood is transported through them. Now, because less blood flows through those dermal blood vessels when they vasoconstrict, then heat is pulled away because the blood is warmer than body temperature. So heat is pulled away from the skin and taken to the organs that are deeper in the body to conserve that heat. So that's why we appear pale when we're cold, because we pull that blood away from the surface. Now on the other side of that, vasodilation of those blood vessels in the dermis mean that the diameter gets bigger, so more blood is transported through those vessels. So the dermal blood vessels then vasodilate, meaning more blood is pushed out to the body surface. This has the effect of shunting the blood to the peripheral parts of the body and away from the deeper structures. So vasodilation of the dermal blood vessels helps us to release heat. This is also what happens when you're exercising and your face gets red. It's because we have vasodilation pushing that blood out there to help relieve that heat, but also to deliver oxygen to muscles so we can make more ATP. But what about the opposite? On cold days, what happens? Your face becomes pale. On warm days, your face becomes red, and it's all due to this vasodilation. All right, a couple more functions of the skin include the immune function, and we've talked about this already when we talked about those dendritic cells that we find in the stratum spinosum of the epidermis and also the dendritic cells within the dermis. Now, these, of course, are important in initiating an immune response when pathogens have penetrated the skin, and the dendritic cells in the dermis help us to mount an attack against epidermal cancer cells. And the last of the functions that we'll cover of the skin is sensory reception. So that's the ability of tactile receptors to detect stimulus from outside the body, such as touch, pressure, tickle, heat, cold. So we have 7 major types of receptors that are found within the skin. They detect, distinguish, and send that information to the brain so we can interpret that stimuli.